single act of creation can unleash a world's worth of ruin. In the blessed realm of Valinor, the elf Fëanor achieved the impossible, forging 3 jewels called the Silmarils. He captured the very light of the 2 trees within them, gems of such divine beauty, they were beyond any treasure. Yet this supreme act of craft did not go unseen. The Dark Lord Morgoth coveted them with a burning hunger. His gaze fell upon the Silmarils, and in that moment, the destiny of every free people was sealed. The fate of elves, men, and dwarves became forever bound to the fate of these jewels, and everything they held sacred was suddenly placed in terrible peril. By the end of this story, you will understand how 3 radiant gems forge the very resilience and alliances that define our most beloved tales of good against overwhelming shadow. We will see how a single choice can echo for thousands of years, and why some creations are too beautiful for the world to safely hold. I am always curious, by the way, to know where a story finds you. If you feel so inclined, I would love to hear where you are listening from and what the local time is there. What do you believe is the true cost of creating something perfect? That divine light did not last. In the profound silence that followed their creation, a shadow was already moving. The dark Vala Morgoth, consumed by his desire, found a willing partner in the monstrous spider spirit Ungoliant. Together, they enacted a crime that would shatter the world. Ungoliant devoured the light of the 2 trees themselves, draining them until they stood as lifeless husks, and Valinor was plunged into an unimaginable darkness. In that eternal night, Morgoth struck at the heart of the Noldor, stealing the Silmarils from Fëanor's own stronghold and fleeing back to his fortress in Middle-earth. The devastation was absolute. The source of all blessed light was gone, and the great works of the gods were undone, but the true catastrophe was only beginning. Blinded by a grief that twisted into all-consuming rage, Fëanor stood before his people. He named Morgoth, now forever the Black Foe, and in a fiery speech, he convinced the majority of the Noldor to abandon paradise and follow him to Middle-earth in pursuit of vengeance and their stolen legacy. Yet it was his next act that forged a chain of doom stronger than any mithril. With his 7 sons, Fëanor swore a terrible oath. They called upon the One himself to witness their vow, pledging to pursue with hatred and vengeance any being, be it Vala, elf, or man, who withheld a Silmaril from their house. This was no noble promise, it was a curse spoken aloud. The very air grew heavy with the weight of it. In that moment, Fëanor elevated his creation above kin, above law, and above the wisdom of the gods. This oath of pride immediately cast a shadow over his entire house, binding his sons and all who followed them to a path of certain tragedy. It forced every single Noldor elf to make an impossible choice. They could remain in the safety of a darkened Valinor, or they could follow their prince into exile, bound to a fate they did not choose, all for the gleam of 3 jewels. The free peoples were now divided, and the first great sundering of the elves began, all under the shadow of an oath that would demand a price in blood for ages to come. So the great march began, a procession of exiles leaving paradise behind. Fëanor led his vast host of Noldor northward, but a terrible truth soon became clear. The icy passage to Middle-earth was guarded by the Valar, who had laid a forbidding chain of mountains across their path. The only other route was a dreadful one, a grinding journey across the grinding ice of the Helcaraxe in the far north. Desperate for a swift crossing to pursue Morgoth, Fëanor arrived at the shores of Aman and made a fateful demand of the Teleri Elves, the master shipwrights. He asked for their beautiful white swan ships. When the Teleri refused, bound by their love for their creations and the laws of the Valor, Fëanor's rage, fueled by his terrible oath, saw only obstruction. His followers drew their swords. What followed was the first kinslaying, a horror never before seen in the undying lands. Elf slew elf on those shimmering shores, staining the water and the sand with the blood of kin. The ships were taken by force. This was not a battle against the darkness. It was a massacre born of pride and impatience. With this single act, the Noldor were irrevocably stained. Their exile was no longer just a matter of leaving. It was now a sentence. The Valor pronounced their doom, the doom of Mandos, declaring that their oath would drive them to treachery, and their hope would be lost. A curse of sorrow and strife would follow their every step. Their path to Middle-earth was now paved not with righteous vengeance, but with grief and a divine condemnation that would haunt their every future endeavor. They had gained a fleet, but they had sacrificed their innocence, and the shadow of Alqualondë would stretch across the ages. The stolen ships carried Fëanor and his closest followers across the sea, but they did not carry his conscience. He stepped onto the shores of Middle-earth, a land already shrouded in the shadow of Morgoth, and made a decision that would fracture his people for centuries. Looking back at the White Fleet anchored in the Bay of Loskar, he saw not a means of transport for his kin, but a potential tool for his half-brother Fingolfin's ambition. In a cold, calculated move, Fëanor gave the order to set the ships ablaze. The magnificent swan ships of the Teleri, already stained with the blood of their makers, were now consumed by a great fire, their timbers cracking and their white sails turning to ash against the night sky. This was not just destruction, it was a message. It was a declaration that Fëanor's house would rule alone, untroubled by any rival claim to the kingship of the Noldor. He left Fingolfin, his brother's entire host, and all their people stranded on the other side of the sea, trapped in the freezing hell of the Helcaraxe, with no hope of rescue. Can you fathom the depth of that betrayal? To be abandoned by your own kin, not to monsters or dark lords, but to the deliberate malice of the one who was supposed to lead you. The flames at Loskar did more than burn wood. They incinerated the last remnants of trust among the Noldor. This single act transformed a tragic exodus into a civil war waiting to happen. As Fëanor marched inland, his forces were now halved, isolated, and utterly exposed. The great host of the Noldor, the mightiest elven nation ever to walk the earth, had arrived in Middle-earth not as a unified army of liberation, but as two broken, vengeful factions. One was led by a king consumed by his oath, the other by a brother betrayed, forced to endure a horrific crossing that would claim countless lives. They were divided, weakened, and seething with internal hatred, all while Morgoth fortified his terrible stronghold of Angband. The Silmarils had promised them a glorious destiny, but their path was now paved with ash and ice, a self-inflicted wound that left them desperately vulnerable before the gathering storm. And so, with the smoke of betrayal still hanging in the air, the Noldor spread across the land of Beliri. and like a scattering of defiant stars. Under the High King Fingolfin, who had survived the unspeakable horrors of the Helcaraxë, they began to build. They did not raise their banners for open war, not yet. Instead, they wove their strength into the very fabric of the land, establishing hidden kingdoms that would become legends. In the north, Fingolfin himself held court at the great fortress of Barad Ethel, a constant, watchful eye fixed on Morgoth's gates. His brothers and their sons carved out realms of their own, each a bastion of elven power and sorrow. But the most wondrous of these were the secret cities, places of such enchantment that they were meant to remain forever hidden from the enemy. Turgon built Gondolin, a city of white walls and gleaming towers, hidden within a ring of mountains. Finrod raised Nargothrond, a vast, subterranean fortress delved into the banks of the river Narog. These were not just strongholds, they were acts of defiance, beautiful and proud, a declaration that the light of the West would not be so easily extinguished. Yet the Noldor knew they could not stand alone. Their arrival had irrevocably changed the world for the other free peoples who already called Beleriand home. The Grey Elves, the Sindar, who had never seen the light of the two trees, now found themselves caught between the shadow of Angband and the blazing pride of these exiled kinsmen. Alliances were forged, sometimes in friendship, sometimes in necessity. The great elven king Thingol of Doriath, while wary of the Noldor and their cursed oath, saw the strategic need for a united front. His realm became a central, if isolated, pillar of resistance. More surprising were the bonds formed with the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, from the great cities of Noldor and Belugost. Here was an alliance born not of shared blood, but of shared craft. The Noldor marveled at the dwarves' mastery of stone and metal, while the dwarves respected the elves' profound skill and the beauty they could wrought. Together, they created wonders, forging weapons and armor of unparalleled power, building impregnable gates, and sharing knowledge that had been separate for millennia. With every sword forged in the dwarven smithies, and every grey elven scout joining a Noldor patrol, the destinies of these peoples became more tightly knotted. The war against Morgoth was no longer just the Noldor's quest to reclaim 3 jewels. It had become a conflict for the very soul of Middle-earth, a struggle that would demand the courage, the craft, and the very lives of every free race. The Silmarils had drawn the Noldor across the sea, but their presence now compelled elves and dwarves alike to look north to the growing darkness, their fates bound together in a single, sprawling tapestry of resistance. This fragile network of kingdoms and alliances was the only light standing against the encroaching night, a light that would soon be tested by fires from the depths of the earth itself. Fëanor's fire would not burn for long. Still burning with the rage of his betrayal at Loskr, he drove his host forward into the wild lands of Middle-earth, his eyes fixed only on the dark peaks of Thangorodrim, where Morgoth dwelled. He refused to wait for Fingolfin's host, stranded and struggling far behind. In his pride, he believed his own fury alone was enough to shatter the gates of Angband itself. But the Dark Lord was waiting, and he knew the impatience of his enemy. As Fëanor charged ahead, far in advance of his own vanguard, the shadows around him deepened. From the depths of the earth, monsters of flame and shadow arose. Balrogs, ancient demons of terror, fell upon the Elven King. The battle was swift, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Fëanor fought with a ferocity that matched his creations, but he was alone, surrounded by whips of fire and creatures of pure malice. Though his sons rushed to his aid and drove the Balrogs back, the damage was done. Their king lay mortally wounded, his body broken. His sons carried him from that field of defeat, a field they would name the Dagger Nuin Goliath, the battle under the stars. But there was no victory here, only a bitter lesson. As Fëanor's life faded, his fiery spirit, so potent and proud, literally burned its way out of his body, leaving it a hollow shell. His end was as intense and consuming as his life had been. In that moment, the Noldor lost their driving force, their most brilliant and destructive leader, at the very dawn of their long war. And what of his sons? They were not freed by his death. They stood over their father's body, now bound more tightly than ever to the terrible oath they had sworn. The curse had claimed its first and greatest victim, and it had only just begun its work. The Noldor were now a people with a ghost for a king, led by the echoes of a vow that would dictate every desperate move they made from that day forward. For 4 long centuries, the fires of Angband were held in check. The Noldor, led by the High King Fingolfin, established a mighty leaguer, a great ring of steel and vigilance, encircling Morgoth's northern fortress. Watchtowers pierced the sky, and elven riders patrolled the borders without cease. This was not a time of war, but of watchful, waiting peace. The land of Beleriand, for a time, breathed easier. It was during this long twilight that a new people arrived, stepping out of the eastern shadows. They were men, the Atani, the second born of the world, and their coming was a tremor of change in a land defined by immortal strife. These men were not a unified force, but scattered tribes, some fearful and some proud. The elves watched them with a mixture of curiosity and ancient dread, for a prophecy spoke that the fate of the elves was woven with that of mortals. Yet from among these tribes emerged the ones who would be called the Edain, the fathers of men. They proved themselves not as conquerors, but as steadfast allies. They fought with a courage and a fire that even the Eldar marveled at, and in their short, bright lives, they forged bonds of loyalty with the elven kings that would become the stuff of legend. Houses of men were granted lands of their own to steward, like the lords of the House of Bear who served Finrod, and the valiant Halladin who defended their forest home with ferocious tenacity. The Edain earned more than just territory. They earned the profound trust of a people who had seen betrayal fester in their own hearts. The destiny of mortals was now irrevocably linked to the war for the Silmarils, a conflict they had not started, but one they would help define. This was the fragile peace, a garden carefully tended, while a volcano smoldered beneath it. Everyone knew the mountain would one day erupt. The only question was when. The long peace was broken not with a bang, but with a whisper of fire in the north. Morgoth had spent centuries in silence, and now he unleashed his long-prepared assault. From the pits of Angband, he sent forth not a great army, but rivers of poison. Vast torrents of flame and choking smoke poured from the triple peaks of Thangorodrim, flowing south like a slow, deliberate tide of annihilation. This was the Dagger Bragalach, the battle of sudden flame. The carefully maintained siege was shattered in a single, terrible day. The elven watchtowers were engulfed. The green plains of Ard Galen, where the Noldor had once ridden freely, were transformed into a desolate, smoking wasteland, renamed Anfaglith, the gasping dust. Entire elven kingdoms were overrun in the chaos. The great lords of the Noldor fell one by one. Angrod and Ignor, the sons of Fëanor, were slain, their realms extinguished. The house of Beren was all but destroyed, its people scattered or enslaved. The high walls of the elven fortresses, which had seemed so permanent, now felt terrifyingly fragile. In the midst of this cataclysm, the High King Fingolfin felt a despair so profound it became a kind of madness. Believing all was lost, he rode alone to the very gates of Angband. He challenged Morgoth himself to single combat, and the very earth trembled as the Elf King struck the Dark Lord 7 times, wounding him for all time and forcing a cry of pain from the enemy that echoed through the deep places of the world. But it was a hopeless fight. Fingolfin fell, and with him fell the last hope for a swift victory. The forces of light were broken, their power critically diminished. The long defeat had truly begun, and the Silmarils seemed further from reclaiming than ever, their light now buried deep within the most fortified fortress in all of Arda, guarded by a wounded and vengeful god. Out of the ashes of the dagger Bragolach, a new kind of wisdom began to take root. The eldest son of Fëanor, Maedhros, had spent long years as a prisoner on the very peaks of Thangorodrim, and that torment had burned away the worst of his father's reckless pride. He looked upon the shattered kingdoms and the broken sieges, and he understood a terrible truth. No single elven house, no matter how valiant, could ever hope to stand against the endless legions of Angband. The oath he and his brothers had sworn demanded the Silmarils, but that vow would be nothing but empty words if Morgoth was allowed to conquer everything. So Maedhros did the one thing his father would have found unthinkable. He set aside his birthright and his personal claim to the high kingship, reaching out not as a sovereign, but as a supplicant. He sent messengers to every corner of Beleriand, to every remaining fortress and hidden realm, calling for a council of war. This was not a summons from a king to his vassals. It was a plea from one survivor to another, and to the astonishment of all, they answered. From the hidden city of Gondolin, Turgon sent a secret host, a legion of soldiers in gleaming mail. From the caves of Nargothrond, a smaller force marched forth, though its king held back his full strength. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains came, not for oaths or jewels, but for the promise of a fight and the honor of a pact sworn in good faith. Most importantly, the great houses of the Edain rallied their warriors, their loyalty to the elven lords now the bedrock of the entire alliance. Maedhros himself coordinated the grand strategy from the eastern flank, while his brother Maglor held the west. This was the Union of Maedhros, a tapestry of free peoples woven together by desperation and a shared will to survive. For the first time since the Noldor had returned to Middle-earth, elves, men, and dwarves stood shoulder to shoulder under a single banner. They were a single, glittering blade being forged in the fires of their own ruin, a final, desperate gamble to turn back the shadow while they still had the strength to lift a sword. The entire fate of the war now rested on the success of this one coordinated strike. Could a coalition born from failure finally achieve what pure elven pride could not? The hopes of every free being in Beleri, and now marched toward a single, blood-soaked field. The Union of Maedhros marched with a hope the land had not seen in generations. Their grand strategy was a masterwork of coordination. Maedhros would attack from the east, drawing out Morgoth's main army, while Fingon, the new High King, would strike from the west, trapping the enemy host between them. For a moment, it seemed the long defeat might finally be reversed, but Morgoth was not a foe who fought with honor alone. He was a master of lies, and his greatest weapon was the treachery he had sown within the alliance itself. The Union's eastern flank relied heavily on a new people, the Easterling men led by Ulfang. These men had sworn oaths of loyalty, but their hearts were already bought with Morgoth's promises of land and power. As Maedhros launched his assault, his signal fires burning bright against the sky, he expected Fingon to charge, and Fingon did, hearing the distant sounds of battle and believing the moment had come. But the timing was fatally wrong. Maedhros was delayed, his advance slowed by forces secretly guided by Ulfang's betrayers. This created a gap, a fatal pause that Morgoth's commanders exploited perfectly. They focused their entire, overwhelming force on Fingon's western host first, crushing it before Maedhros could arrive to seal the pincer movement. The field became a slaughterhouse. The carefully woven tapestry of the Union was torn apart thread by thread. Elves and dwarves and loyal Edain were cut down together. In the midst of the chaos, as the army of the High King disintegrated, a small rearguard made a desperate stand on a hill of fallen bodies. The men Huor and Hurin of the House of Hador stood with the elven king Turgon of Gondolin. They fought with a fury that held back the enemy tide, minute by precious minute. Knowing his hidden city was the last great secret hope of the elves, Huor looked at Turgon and uttered a prophecy born of despair and foresight. He told the king to retreat, to save himself and his people, for from Turgon and from Huor, new hope would one day spring. Hurin vowed to hold the ground until his king was safe, and so Turgon, his heart breaking, led the survivors of Gondolin away from the carnage, their escape purchased with the lives of the bravest. Hurin fought on until, standing alone, he was finally captured by Morgoth's forces. The battle of unnumbered tears, the Nirneath Arnodead, was over. It was not merely a defeat. It was the end. The power of the Noldor in open war was broken forever. Their kingdoms were now isolated, besieged, and doomed. The dwarves retreated to their mountains, grievously wounded. The great houses of the Edain were decimated, and the Silmarils remained in the crown of the Dark Lord, their light now seeming utterly lost, the very cause of this unimaginable desolation. Yet even in the aftermath of such colossal ruin, the shadow of Morgoth sought out individual hearts to break. The curse that had shattered armies now fell upon a single man, Hurin, the great hero who had defied the Dark Lord at the Nirneath. For his defiance, Morgoth did not merely kill him. He devised a far more cruel punishment, binding Hurin to a stone chair high in the mountains and forcing him to watch with enchanted sight as his curse unfolded upon his wife and children, a slow, deliberate poison seeping into their lives. Their son, Turambar, was destined to become the ultimate testament to this personalized malice. Sent away to safety as a child, Túrin grew into a warrior of immense strength and courage. Yet everywhere he went, the curse followed like a foul wind. He found shelter with an elven king, then refuge with a band of outlaws, and later glory in the hidden elven city of Nargothrond. But in each sanctuary, his pride and the unseen curse wrought havoc. His dearest friend, the elven archer Beleg tracked him through wilderness and peril to save him, only for Túrin to accidentally slay him in a moment of confused, desperate darkness. Can you comprehend that grief? To wake and find your own hand has destroyed your truest companion. This was not a death in fair battle. It was a tragedy orchestrated by a hateful god, a perfect friendship severed by a cruel and invisible hand. The curse then wove its most horrific thread. Túrin's mother and sister, Nînir, journeyed to find him, but Morgoth's ancient servant, the dragon Glorung, awaited them. With a lie spun from malice and a dragon's hypnotic breath, he wiped Nînir's memory clean, leaving her a lost and terrified stranger in the woods. Túrin found this beautiful, nameless woman, cared for her, and eventually married her, all in ignorance. Their happiness was a brief, stolen moment before the dragon returned to shatter it. With his dying breath, Glorung revealed the truth that Túrin had wed his own sister. The horror of that revelation was absolute. Upon hearing it, Nînir cast herself into a raging river, and Túrin, his world in ashes, fell upon his own sword. So ended the life of the greatest warrior of his age, not in a glorious last stand, but in a private, shame-filled suicide, his valor rendered meaningless by a curse he could neither fight nor see. The tale of Túrin is the story of the Silmaril War, distilled into a single, heartbreaking life. It shows how the great conflict corrupted everything it touched, twisting noble qualities like courage and loyalty into instruments of ruin, ensuring that even the most valiant could not escape the long shadow of those three radiant, cursed jewels. Yet even as the curse devoured the house of Hurin, another story was unfolding, a song of love so profound it would challenge the very foundations of fate. In the hidden forests of Doriath, the mortal man Beren, last of his fallen house, laid eyes upon the elf maiden Lúthien Tinúviel as she danced among the hemlocks. In that single glance, the destinies of elf and mortal were irrevocably entwined. But Lúthien was no ordinary elf. She was the daughter of King Thingol and Queen Melian, a being of such power and grace that her very existence was a treasure to her people. When Beren, a ragged wanderer with nothing but his name, dared to ask for her hand, Thingol's wrath was as cold as the Helcaraxe. He saw only a mortal, a brief, flickering life that would steal his daughter's immortality and bring her only grief. So he set a price upon his consent, a task he believed was nothing less than a death sentence. Beren must bring him a Silmaril from the Iron Crown of Morgoth. This was not a quest, it was a cruel joke. To achieve this would mean penetrating the deepest pits of Angband, bypassing legions of orcs, and facing the Dark Lord himself, all for a jewel that had already doomed an entire civilization. Yet Beren accepted, not as a subject obeying his king, but as a man proving the worth of his love. And Lúthien, upon learning of this, did not weep or obey her father. She defied him, choosing a mortal's love over the safety of her immortal realm. She escaped her sylvan prison to follow Beren into the very heart of darkness. Their journey became a legend in itself, with Lúthien's inherent power, a magic that could cast sleep upon the mightiest of foes and make the very stones weep. They passed through horrors no army could survive. They stood together in Morgoth's throne room, a vast cavern echoing with the malice of a god, while Lúthien sang a song of such unearthly beauty and sorrow that it plunged the Dark Lord and all his court into a profound enchantment. Beren crept forward. With a knife, he pried one of the Silmarils from the crown. For a single, impossible moment, the pure light of the two trees, lost for centuries, blazed forth in the deepest pit of evil, a silent, defiant victory. But escape from such a place always demands a price. As they fled, the great wolf Carcharoth, the guardian of Angband's gate, attacked. In a flash of teeth and fury, he bit off Beren's hand, the very hand that held the Silmaril. The holy jewel now burned within the beast's belly, a fire of purity that drove it mad with agony, sending it rampaging through the forests of Doriath. Beren and Lúthien returned to her father, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Beren held up his maimed arm and declared that yes, a Silmaril was now in Thingol's hand, though the hand itself was in the belly of the wolf. They had done the impossible. They had fulfilled the terrible price and proven that love could achieve what armies and oaths could not. Yet their personal cost was immense. Beren was mortally wounded in the final hunt for the wolf, and Lúthien, facing a life without him, chose a mortal death, her spirit departing the world to follow his. Their story stands as a radiant counterpoint to the grim tragedies of the Oath. They took a Silmaril not for pride or possession, but for love, and in doing so, they brought a fragment of lost light back into the world, a light that would now ignite a different, even more devastating kind of conflict. That single Silmaril, won by love and paid for with a life, now rested in the heart of Doriath. King Thingol, holding the jewel that had cost Beren and Lúthien everything, felt its radiance rekindle an ancient pride within him. He decided to have the Silmaril remade, not merely as a treasure, but as a testament. He summoned the most skilled dwarf craftsmen from Noldor to his halls, commissioning them to set the holy jewel within his greatest heirloom, the magnificent necklace called the Nauglamír. The dwarves worked with a reverence born of awe, for they had never seen such a union of elven grace and divine light. But as they labored, that awe curdled into a dark, possessive desire. They began to see the Nauglamír not as a work commissioned by a king, but as a masterpiece of their own craft, a masterpiece made infinitely more valuable by the Silmaril they now believed was their rightful payment. Upon its completion, a terrible dispute erupted. The dwarves, their hearts poisoned by greed, claimed the necklace as their own wage. Thingol, outraged at this betrayal, scorned them with harsh words. In the ensuing fury, the dwarves murdered the Elven king within his own sacred halls, seized the Nauglamír, and fled. This was not a battle, it was an assassination, a treacherous act that shattered the long and fragile peace between the two races. The dwarves of Noldor, however, would not escape their crime. They were waylaid by a force of vengeful elves, and the forest itself seemed to rise against them, and the necklace was reclaimed. But the damage was done. The Silmaril had claimed another life, and this time it had ignited a fire of hatred between former allies that would burn for ages. Word of the jewel's location, now blazoned upon the Nauglamír and held by Thingol's widow, Queen Melian, spread like a plague. It reached the 7 sons of Fëanor, whose terrible oath had lain dormant, but never dead. The vow they had sworn upon the One himself now stirred, a venomous serpent uncoiling in their hearts. They saw the Silmaril not as a treasure won through sacrifice, but as a birthright unlawfully withheld. They sent a demand to Doriath, a stark ultimatum ordering the surrender of the jewel. But Doriath, grieving and leaderless, was now protected only by the fading power of Melian. When their demand was refused, the sons of Fëanor marched. They led their warriors into the very heart of the Forest Kingdom, a realm that had once been a sanctuary. What followed was the Second Kinslaying. Elf fought elf once more, staining the leaves and streams of Doriath with the blood of kin. The grief was so profound, so absolute, that it severed Queen Melian's connection to the land. Her power, the magical girdle of Melian that had protected the realm for millennia, vanished like a mist in the morning sun. Doriath lay open and defenseless. The sons of Fëanor had achieved their objective, but they did not find the Silmaril. It had been smuggled away from the slaughter, a flickering ember of light carried from one ruin to the next. Their oath had driven them to commit an atrocity that hollowed out another great elven kingdom, all for a jewel that slipped through their fingers once again. With each bloody act, the curse tightened, proving that the Silmarils did not bring power, only an endless, self-consuming hunger. The Silmaril found its way to a new guardian, a child who carried the weight of two legendary bloodlines. Elwing, the granddaughter of Beren and Lúthien, fled the ruins of Doriath with the Nauglamír clutched tight. She was the last living memory of that kingdom, a vessel of both immense hope and terrible danger. Her flight led her south, to the very edge of the continent, where the river Sirion met the Great Sea. Here, the last survivors of Beleriand had gathered. Refugees from shattered Gondolin, the few who escaped the sacking of Doriath, and the remaining Edain, all huddled together in a collection of simple dwellings. This haven at the mouths of Sirion was a desperate patchwork of lost homes, a fragile piece woven from shared grief. For a time, the curse seemed to sleep. Elwing grew to womanhood, marrying Eärendil the Mariner, himself a refugee from the fallen city of Gondolin. Together, they embodied the union of the great elven houses, and in their keeping, the Silmaril blazed with a gentle light, a beacon that felt, for a moment, like a promise of renewal rather than a harbinger of doom. Yet the peace was an illusion, a thin crust over a volcano. The sons of Fëanor, though their numbers were dwindling, could never forget the jewel that had slipped through their grasp twice. Their oath was a phantom limb that still ached, a compulsion that festered with each passing year. They knew where the Silmaril was. They knew who held it. And the fragile community at the mouths of Sirion, built on the ashes of so many other kingdoms, was about to learn that no sanctuary was sacred enough to be spared from the oath's hunger. The stage was set for one last, tragic act of kin, turning against kin, where the last light of the free peoples would be threatened by the very ones who claimed it as their right. The peace at the mouths of Sirion was a beautiful, brittle lie. The sons of Fëanor, their numbers thinned by war and their spirits hollowed by their oath, looked upon that last refuge of light and saw only a theft that mocked them. The Silmaril was there, gleaming around the neck of Elwing, a treasure they believed was theirs by a right written in blood. And so, with a grim finality, they marched on the one place that was supposed to be safe from the long shadow of their curse. They came not as liberators, but as executioners. The attack was swift and merciless. This was the Third Kinslaying, the final, chilling echo of the first massacre at Alqualondë. Elves who had survived the fall of every other kingdom now found themselves fighting for their lives against their own kin, their swords clashing on the very shores where they had sought sanctuary. The air, once filled with the sound of the sea, and the whispers of hope, was now thick with the cries of the dying and the reek of smoke. In the heart of the chaos, trapped within her house, Elwing faced an impossible choice. Surrender the jewel and betray the legacy of Beren and Lúthien, the very love that had won it, or see it taken by force and used to fuel more ruin. She chose a third, desperate path. With the Nauglamír held tight, she fled to the edge of a high cliff, overlooking the roaring sea, and as the forces of the Oath closed in, she did not hesitate. She cast herself into the churning waves below, a flash of white and gold, swallowed by the dark water. For the sons of Fëanor, it must have seemed like the ultimate failure. The jewel was lost, and another realm of their own people was drenched in innocent blood. But the story was not over. Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, himself intervened. Elwing did not drown. She was transformed, given a new form as a great white sea-bird, and with the Silmaril bound to her breast like a star, she flew across the ocean in a desperate search for her husband, Eärendil, who was sailing the seas in search of a path to the undying lands. Yet in the ruined haven, a different tragedy was unfolding. The attackers discovered Elwing's two young sons, Elrond and Elros, hiding in a cave. They were mere children, heirs to the noblest bloodlines of elves and men, and now they were prisoners of the very ones who had just slaughtered their community. What do you do with the orphans of a massacre you yourself committed? The youngest son, Maeghlor, whose heart was not entirely hardened, looked upon the boys and felt the weight of his crimes in a way his brothers could not. He took them not as slaves, but as fosterlings. In an act of bitter irony, the last two sons of Fëanor, the bearers of the most destructive oath in history, became the guardians of the children whose home they had destroyed. In that single, confused act of mercy, amidst the carnage, the fates of Elrond and Elros were irrevocably woven into the legacy of the Silmarils. They were raised by their family's murderers, a living testament to a conflict that consumed everything it touched, their very existence a question mark on the future of a broken world. While his wife's fate remained a mystery to him, Eärendil sailed ever westward, his heart a hollow echo of the home he had lost. His quest had begun as a mission to find the undying lands and beg the Valor for aid, but now it was fueled by a more desperate need, to find Elwing and save whatever fragments of their world remained. His ship, Fingolfin, was built for this impossible journey, crafted with elven skill and a mortal's determination. For years he wandered the trackless oceans, a tiny speck against the endless gray waves, guided only by the stars and the terrible longing in his soul. He was utterly alone, a mariner caught between a ruined past and a future that seemed to have no shore. Then, a miracle approached on wings of white. The great seabird, bearing a brilliant light upon its breast, descended onto the deck of Fingolfin. In that moment of reunion, the light of the Silmaril revealed the truth. This was no ordinary bird, but his beloved Elwing, transformed and saved by the power of the sea. She had found him, and she brought with her the one thing that could pierce the gloom of their exile. Together again, with the holy jewel now bound fast to Eärendil's brow, their purpose was reforged, stronger than ever. The light of the Silmaril, which had caused so much bloodshed and betrayal, now became their sole guide, cutting through the enchanted mists and hidden perils that guarded the straight road to the west. It was a light of pure creation, and it recognized the purity of their plea. It led them through paths no mortal ship had ever sailed, past the shadows of the world, until before them arose the impossibly white shores and piercing light of Valinor itself. Stepping onto that sacred ground, Eärendil carried the burdens of two kindreds. He was the herald of both elves and men, and he pleaded not for victory, but for pity. He stood before the thrones of the powers and begged for mercy for the peoples of Middle-earth, who were being crushed under a shadow they could no longer withstand. He offered himself as their voice, a living testament to all they had suffered and all they had lost for the sake of a light the valor themselves had let be stolen. The valor were moved, not just by his words, but by his very being. Here was a son of both worlds, whose love had achieved what armies and oaths could not, bringing a fragment of their own lost light back to them as a symbol of hope. His voyage broke the cycle. It was the first selfless act connected to a Silmaril that did not demand possession, but offered a return. As a reward for his courage and a solution to his mixed heritage, a unique fate was decreed. Eärendil, with the Silmaril bound to his brow, would be set to sail the heavens in his ship Fingolfin, a brilliant, everlasting star. He became a sign of hope for all who dwelt in Middle-earth, a constant reminder that the valor had not wholly abandoned them, and that even the deepest darkness could be pierced by a single, steadfast light. His star would be seen by every free people, a promise written in the sky that their struggles were not in vain. Eärendil's star was not just a sign, it was a summons. His voyage and his plea had shattered the long silence of the valor. For the first time since the darkening of the trees, the powers of the world looked upon Middle-earth with a resolve born of pity and wrath. They would intervene. The great war host of the West was assembled, a force unseen since the shaping of the world. This was not merely an army, it was the very might of Ammon given form. The host was led by Eärendil, the herald of Manwë, a being of immense power and authority. At his side marched the Vanyar, the fairest and most loyal of the elven kindreds, who had never left the blessed realm. They were joined by many of the Noldor who had remained in Valinor, their hearts now steeled to confront the folly of their kin and the enemy who had caused it. Even some of the Teleri, their grief for their stolen ships and slain kin still fresh, set sail once more, their white ships now carrying a host of vengeance. This was the War of Wrath, and its coming was like the turning of the world. The foundations of the continent shook as this divine army landed on the shores of Beleriand. For the free peoples who had endured centuries of darkness, the sight was beyond comprehension. After generations of defeat and dwindling hope, the valor had finally answered their cries. The very air seemed to crackle with a power that made the shadow of Morgoth recoil. His legions of orcs, which had seemed numberless, were like dust before a hurricane. His dragons, the terror of the battlefield, were met by the host of the Maiar, spirits of fire and light, who could match them in ferocity and power. The great eagles of Manwë filled the skies, their cries heralding the downfall of the Dark Lord. This was not a war of attrition, it was an annihilation. The forces of Angband were broken, their fortresses cast down, and the land itself was reshaped in the cataclysm of the conflict. The Balrogs were destroyed, one by one, until the last of them fled into the deepest pits of the earth. The war was so devastating that the very geography of Beleriand could not withstand its fury. Plains sank, mountains crumbled, and vast tracts of land were swallowed by the rising sea. This was the price for Morgoth's removal, a continental sacrifice that would forever erase the stage upon which the great drama of the Silmarils had been played out. The war raged for 4 decades, but its outcome was never truly in doubt. It was the final, definitive confrontation between the created order and the will of a rebel god, a battle that would decide once and for all if light or shadow would govern the dawn of the world. The war did not merely rage across the land, it unmade the land itself. As the host of Valinor drove deep into the heart of Morgoth's dominion, the conflict escalated beyond armies clashing on a field. It became a geological event, the sheer power being unleashed, the divine fury of the Valar contesting the concentrated malice of the first Dark Lord was more than the continent of Beleriand could bear. The ground split asunder, swallowing entire legions. Mountains that had stood since the dawn of time were thrown down like toys, and vast chasms opened, vomiting fire and black smoke. The sky was a chaos of battling eagles and winged dragons, their shrieks and roars a symphony of the world's ending. In this final, desperate act, Morgoth unleashed his last and most terrible creations, the winged dragons, led by the colossal Alqualondë, the Black. Their shadow was a plague, darkening the sun itself, but even their terror was met. The great eagle Thorondor and his kin, led by Eärendil himself, rose to meet them in an aerial war that would decide the fate of the heavens. The conflict reached its climax when Eärendil himself, sailing the sky in his radiant ship Fingolfin, joined the fray. The Silmaril on his brow blazed with a light the dragons could not endure, and in a battle that lasted an entire day, he fought and slew Alqualondë, the Black. The fall of the great dragon was a cataclysm in itself. His colossal body tumbled from the sky, smashing onto the triple peaks of Thangorodrim, and the very towers of Morgoth's pride were broken into dust. With his last defenses shattered, Morgoth was dragged from the deepest pit of Angband and cast out of the world forever, his iron crown beaten into a collar, and his reign of terror brought to a final, absolute end. But the victory was as terrible as the enemy. The violence of the war had strained the fabric of Beleriand to its breaking point. The land groaned, fractured, and began to sink. One by one, the proud kingdoms of the Noldor, the forests of Doriath, the plains of Ardgalen, all were consumed by the inexorable rise of the sea, the very stage upon which the entire drama of the Silmarils had been enacted. A continent steeped in so much blood, beauty, and sorrow was now sacrificed, vanishing beneath the waves as the permanent, terrible price for removing Morgoth's shadow. The war was won, but the cost was a world itself, lost to memory and song. Yet even absolute victory could not cleanse the curse of the oath. As the dust settled on a drowned continent, the 2 remaining Silmarils were recovered from the ruins of Angband, their light undimmed by the centuries of darkness. They were placed in the custody of Eärendil, the herald of the Valar, who decreed that any who had sworn the wicked Oath of Fëanor had forfeited all claim to them. But the sons of Fëanor were not so easily released. Of the 7 brothers, only 2 remained, Maedhros and Maegor, their spirits worn thin by ages of grief and bloodshed. The oath, that terrible vow sworn so long ago, still had its hooks in their hearts. It was a compulsion they could not disobey, a ghost that would not let them rest. They came before Eärendil, not as conquering heroes, but as broken souls, and they demanded what they believed was their birthright. The herald, in his wisdom, refused them. He saw the darkness that clung to their claim, and knew that no good could come from delivering the holy jewels back into hands stained by kinslaying. But the brothers were beyond reason. Driven by the very pride that had started their long descent, they stole the Silmarils. In that moment of theft, a profound and terrible judgment was rendered. The jewels, hallowed by the light of the two trees, perceived the corruption in their new bearers. They would not suffer the touch of such hands. As Maedhros and Nauglamír clutched their prizes, the Silmarils burned them. This was no ordinary fire. It was a sacred agony, a pain that seared not just flesh but spirit, a physical manifestation of their moral bankruptcy, the very objects of their lifelong quest, the treasures for which they had sacrificed everything, now rejected them utterly. The quest was over, and it had ended in absolute, irrevocable despair. Maedhros, his body and soul in torment, could bear the world no longer. He looked upon the jewel that had become an instrument of his torture, and in a final, desperate act, he cast himself and the Silmaril into a gaping fiery chasm, consumed by the very element that had always mirrored his fierce spirit. Nauglamír, the singer whose heart had always held a sliver of remorse, could not follow his brother into that final fire, but neither could he live with the burning jewel in his possession. He went to the edge of the world, and with all his strength, hurled his Silmaril into the vast, waiting sea. It sank beneath the waves, its light lost to all but the deepest waters. And so Nauglamír, the last son of Fëanor, did not die. He became a wanderer, a lonely figure forever singing his lament along the shores of the world, a living ghost bound to a sorrow as endless as the ocean. The great quest for the Silmarils ended not in triumph, but in ash and salt water, a testament to the futility of an oath that valued a creation more than kinship, and possession more than peace. The world was broken, but it was not ended. As the waves settled over drowned Beleriand, a new chapter for the free peoples began, one defined not by a desperate war against a god, but by the quieter, more enduring work of rebuilding. With Morgoth finally cast into the void, the Valar offered the Elves a profound and merciful choice. They could forsake the mortal shores of Middle-earth, with all its scars and sorrows, and sail into the west to dwell forever in the peace of the undying lands. Or they could remain. For many, the choice was clear. The High King Gil-galad, last in the direct line of the Noldor kings, established a new realm in the coastal haven of Lindon, a fragment of the lost lands that had survived the cataclysm. Here, under his just rule, the Elves began to heal, their culture no longer defined solely by a quest for jewels, but by the hard-won wisdom of their long defeat. And then there was Elrond half-elven, the orphan of the Third Kinslaying, raised by the very ones who had destroyed his home. His life was a living bridge between the tragic past and an uncertain future. He did not choose the path of his brother Elros, who became the first king of the great island of Númenor, a gifted realm for the loyal Edain. Instead, Elrond chose the life of the Eldar, remaining in Middle-earth as a lore master and a healer. In the deep valley of Imladris, which men would later call Rivendell, he founded a last homely house, a sanctuary of memory and wisdom. His very presence was a gift to the rising world, a quiet guardian who carried within him the entire history of the First Age, its glories and its griefs. The Elves who stayed became the shepherds of the Second Age. They did not seek to build vast empires or reclaim lost treasures. Their role was subtler, more profound. They taught the scattered tribes of men, guiding their first steps into civilization, sharing knowledge of craft, language, and the stars. They became the guardians of history, ensuring that the sacrifices of Beren and Lúthien, of Fingolfin and Hurin, would not be forgotten. The shadow of the Silmarils was gone, but their legacy was this: a resilience forged in unimaginable fire, a wisdom paid for with blood, and a commitment to protect the light that remained in a world forever touched by shadow. And so, from the ashes of a drowned continent, a new star rose in the west. For their steadfast loyalty and immense sacrifices in the long war against Morgoth, the valor granted the Edain, the fathers of men, a gift beyond any mortal dream. They raised a great island from the depths of the sea, situated between the lost lands of Middle-earth and the forbidden shores of the Undying Lands. This was Númenor, the land of the gift, a realm of rolling hills, sheltered harbors, and soaring mountains, with a central peak, so high its summit it was said to pierce the clouds. Here, the Edain were granted lives of peace, wisdom, and longevity. Their years stretched to 5 times that of ordinary men. They were to be the teachers and guides for the lesser tribes of Middle-earth, a bridge between the fading world of the Elves and the rising age of humanity. To lead this new people, the Valar chose a king whose very bloodline embodied this transition. Elros, the son of Eärendil and Elwing, and brother to Elrond, was granted the choice of his fate. Where Elrond chose the immortal life of the Elves, Elros chose to belong to the race of his mortal ancestors. He became Tar Miniatur, the first king of Númenor. Under his long and wise rule, the Númenóreans flourished. They became master shipwrights, building vessels that could sail any sea, and their civilization reached heights of art, science, and architecture that would never be seen again. They learned from the Elves who still visited them from the west, and for many centuries they honored the ban of the Valar, which forbade them from sailing so far west that the shores of the Undying Lands came into sight. They were the great hope for the future of men, a people untainted by the shadow, their very existence a reward for the blood spilled in the pursuit of the Silmarils. Yet this golden age carried a subtle, inherent tension. Their longevity was a gift, but it was not the immortality they saw in their elven teachers and kin. Their island was a paradise, but it was a place set apart, a constant reminder of what lay just beyond the horizon, forever out of reach. The legacy of the Silmarils, those jewels of impossible beauty and terrible cost, had not vanished. It had simply transformed. It became a deep, quiet yearning for a light that was lost, a perfection just beyond their grasp, a seed of discontent that would one day grow into a shadow as vast as any they had helped to defeat. That deep yearning for a light undimmed, a world preserved from the slow decay of time, did not die with the Silmarils. It simply found a new home in the hearts of the Elves who remained in Middle-earth. In the Second Age, the greatest of these elven realms was a region, a land of master smiths who lived in the shadow of the misty mountains. Their leader was Celebrimbor, a name that carried the weight of a terrible legacy. He was the grandson of Fëanor himself. In his blood ran the same unparalleled genius for craft, the same burning desire to create things of lasting beauty. But he also carried the memory of his grandfather's pride and the ruin it had unleashed. His life's work became a conscious effort to escape that shadow, to create not for possession, but for preservation. He sought not to capture a divine light, but to halt the slow fading of the elves themselves, to make Middle-earth a timeless, blessed land. This noble goal, however, would lead him down a path eerily similar to his grandfather's. He and his fellow smiths began their greatest work, the forging of the rings of power. They were not alone in this endeavor. A new ally came to them, a figure of immense knowledge and power, who called himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. He offered them secrets of craft they had never dreamed of, techniques to imbue the rings with the power to hold back time, to heal the wounds of the world, and to make the lands of the elves as fair as Valinor itself. Blinded by their own ambition and the allure of his wisdom, they accepted his aid. Under his guidance, they forged 16 great rings, but in secret, Celebrimbor, using his own pure skill alone, crafted 3 more, the mightiest of all, untouched by their mysterious patron. These were the rings of the Elven kings, and they were made with a power of preservation and concealment, free from any taint of darkness. Yet the entire endeavor was a masterpiece of deception. Annatar was not an emissary of the Valar. He was Sauron, the most loyal and cunning of Morgoth's servants, who had survived the War of Wrath and now sought to finish his master's work. In the fires of Oaradruin, Mount Doom, he forged one final ring, a master ring to rule all the others, and as he placed it upon his finger and spoke the incantation, the elves finally understood the depth of their folly. Celebrimbor and his smiths felt the dominating will of Sauron through the rings they had made. They heard his voice in their minds, a claim of absolute ownership. In that horrifying moment, they realized they had not been building a paradise. They had been forging their own chains. They had, with the best of intentions, recreated the central tragedy of their people. Just as Fëanor's desire to possess the Silmarils had doomed the Noldor, their desire to preserve their world had handed its control to the very enemy they sought to defy. They tore the rings from their fingers, hiding the 3 pure ones from Sauron's grasp, but the damage was done. The tools of their preservation had become the instruments of their subjugation, and the long peace of the Second Age was shattered by the same ancient hunger for mastery that had once shattered the world. The shadow of the Silmarils had taught a bitter lesson, but the heart of a king can forget what the soul of a people remembers. For all their wisdom and power, the Númenorians could not escape the slow, gnawing envy of their own mortality. They looked upon the deathless elves, their allies and teachers, and saw not friendship, but a privilege denied to them. They tended the white tree, symbol of their bond with the West, yet they began to resent the very band that protected them. Into this fertile ground of discontent, a new advisor arrived, a prisoner of war who would become the most influential voice in the king's court. He was Sauron, the former lieutenant of Morgoth, and he recognized the old, familiar hunger in the hearts of men. He did not arrive with armies, but with whispers. He spoke not of darkness, but of light unjustly withheld. He fed their pride, telling them they were mighty enough to claim the immortality that was their right, that the Valar were not protectors but jailers, hoarding eternal life for themselves. The same pride that had once driven Fëanor to create and covet now twisted the Númenorians to defy and demand. The king, Ar-Pharazôn, his heart poisoned by this counsel, made a decision that echoed Fëanor's rebellion. He would not craft jewels, but he would build the greatest armada the world had ever seen. He would not cross a grinding ice, but a forbidden sea. His goal was not to reclaim a lost light, but to seize an eternal one. to wage war upon the gods themselves in their own blessed land. The fleet was a terrifying spectacle, a forest of masts and black sails, blotting out the horizon, carrying the arrogance of an entire civilization. They landed on the undying shores, their swords drawn against a silence more profound than any battle. But they found no armies waiting for them. They found only a stillness that judged them. In that moment, they had achieved the ultimate act of pride, and it was their final one. The Valor laid down their guardianship and called upon Isildur, the one who answered with a cataclysm that rewrote the laws of the world. The seas rose in a titanic wave, the land cracked and foundered, and the fair island of Númenor, the land of the gift, was pulled into a great abyss, drowning its kings, its armies, and its pride beneath the unforgiving ocean. The world was made round, the straight road to the west was hidden, and the undying lands were removed forever from the circles of the mortal world. This was not merely a punishment. It was a severance, the desire to possess what was not meant to be possessed. A theme born with the Silmarils had reached its logical, world-altering conclusion. The light they had sought was not in the west. It was a warning they had failed to heed. From the cataclysm that sank Númenor, a handful of survivors washed ashore on the coasts of Middle-earth. They were the faithful, led by Eärendil the Tall, who had kept the old alliances and rejected the king's pride. They carried with them the shards of Númenor's greatness, a few heirlooms, and a desperate resolve. They were not conquerors, but refugees, yet their arrival was the spark for one last grand coalition. In the north, Eärendil established the realm of Arda, and in the south, his son Isildur founded Gondor, planting a sapling of the white tree in memory of all that was lost. But their work of building was immediately threatened. Sauron had survived the drowning of Númenor, his spirit fleeing back to Middle-earth to take up his old dominions. He regrouped in Mordor, and his power grew swiftly, a new shadow rising from the ashes of the old. The Elves, watching this resurgence from their havens in Lindon and Rivendell, knew they faced a terrible choice. They could retreat into hiding, preserving their remaining strength, or they could stand and fight one last time. The High King Gil-galad made his decision. He sent out a call to arms, and Eärendil answered. Together, the Elf King and the Man of the West forged the last alliance. This was not merely an army. It was a living memory, a direct and conscious echo of the Union of Maedhros from an age long past. Once again, elves and men would march together under a single banner, their spears and swords glinting in a unified front against the darkness. They were determined not to repeat the betrayals and failures of that first great union. This time, the alliance was built on a foundation of pure necessity and a shared understanding of the cost of failure. Gil-galad wielded his spear Eaglos, and Eärendil carried the great sword Narsil, and beside them stood the wisest of the Eldar, like Elrond, who served as herald, a living link to every tragedy and triumph that had led to this moment. The host that marched out of Imladris was a sight to stir the heart and chill the blood, a final, magnificent gathering of the free peoples before their long twilight began. Their goal was absolute, to break the gate of the Black Land and challenge Sauron in his very throne room. They knew this was the last chance to stop a shadow that had learned from its master and was now, in many ways, even more cunning and patient. The fate of the entire world would be decided not by a single jewel, but by the strength of a vow between two kindreds, a vow to end the cycle of war that began with 3 perfect gems. The plain of Dagorlad was a vast, choked expanse where the fate of the world would be decided by mud and blood. Here, at the very gates of Mordor, the last alliance met the endless legions of Sauron. The battle was not a swift clash, but a grueling, day-long slaughter. Orcs and trolls poured from the Black Gate in a seemingly inexhaustible tide, crashing against the shimmering shields of the elves and the steady lines of men. The air grew thick with the reek of filth and death. The ground churned into a foul mire by the trampling of countless feet. Victory was achieved, but the cost was a river of life that would never flow again. In the heart of the carnage, the 2 great leaders, High King Gil-galad and Elendil of the Dunedain, fought their way toward the Dark Tower itself, challenging the very source of the shadow. Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, fell in that final push, burned by the heat of Sauron's hand. His death was more than the loss of a commander. It was the extinguishing of a light. With him perished the last living memory of the undying lands held by a ruling monarch, the last direct link to the glory and the folly of the ancient elven kings who had once challenged a god. His sacrifice, and that of so many of his kindred, carved a path to the final confrontation, but it left the elves forever diminished. They had spent the last of their ancient strength on that field, and though they would remain in Middle-earth for long ages, their time of building great kingdoms and leading grand armies was over. Their power, once so brilliant it could capture light in a jewel, now began its long, slow fade into memory. The Siege of Barad-dûr lasted for 7 long years, a grinding war of attrition beneath the ashen skies of Mordor. The great host of the last alliance encircled the Dark Tower, but they could not storm it. They settled in for a watchful, weary blockade, building fortified camps and setting endless patrols along the perimeter. This was not a battle of glorious charges, but of mud, disease, and dwindling supplies. The spirits of men, whose lives were so fleeting, were worn down by the relentless passage of seasons, with no end in sight. The elves, with their long memory, felt a profound and chilling sense of déjà vu. This was the Siege of Angband, and all over again, a grim repetition of the long watch their ancestors had maintained centuries before. The same patience was required, the same vigilance, and the same terrible cost in lives, spent not in a single, decisive clash, but in the slow, draining erosion of a prolonged stalemate. The shadow they fought had simply taken a new form, and the free peoples were once again paying the price in blood and time for every inch of ground they denied the enemy. It was a stark lesson that the struggle for Arda was not a single war to be won, but a recurring burden that each generation must shoulder. How many times must the same story be written in different blood? The alliance held, but it was a fragile thing, tested daily by the despair that seeped from the very stones of that land. They were not just fighting Sauron's army, they were fighting the weight of history itself, proving that some shadows must be faced again and again. The siege finally broke. In a final, desperate assault, Sauron himself strode forth from his tower. He fought with the concentrated malice of ages, and in that last terrible confrontation, he slew Elendil, breaking the sword Narsil beneath him. But as the king fell, his son Isildur seized the hilt shard of his father's blade, and with a final surge of strength, cut the one ring from Sauron's hand. The The Dark Lord's form collapsed, his spirit scattering like smoke on the wind. The war was won. The forces of Mordor fled in disarray, and the free people stood victorious at last. In the aftermath, the leaders of the Alliance gathered at the fiery core of Mount Doom, the very place where the ring was forged. Elrond and Círdan, the shipwright, stood with Isildur at the crack of doom. They urged him, they pleaded with him, to cast the ring into the fire and end Sauron's threat forever. But Isildur hesitated. He held the gold band in his hand, and he felt its power, a seductive whisper promising strength, order, and a lasting memorial for his fallen father and his people. He looked upon it, this thing that had caused so much ruin, and he saw not a weapon of the enemy, but a weregild, a payment for the blood of his family. He refused. He claimed it as his own. In that single, fateful moment, the long lesson of the Silmarils was forgotten. Isildur's choice was an echo of Fëanor's oath, a tragic repetition of the belief that a thing of immense power could be owned, could be mastered for a noble cause. He saw himself not as a custodian of a dangerous artifact, but as its rightful possessor. By claiming the ring, he did not secure his father's legacy, he betrayed it. He allowed the core of Sauron's power to endure, ensuring the Dark Lord's spirit would one day gather strength again. The cycle of obsession and possession, a curse that began with 3 radiant jewels, had now found its way onto the finger of a king, dooming the world to centuries more of fear and war, all because one man could not bring himself to let go. The glow of the elven rings was fading, as Sauron's shadow stretched once more across Middle-earth. The power that had preserved their havens began to ebb like a slow tide. The woods of Lothlorien, once a golden realm outside of time, felt the creeping touch of mortality. The very air in Rivendell grew thinner, its melodies tinged with a profound and ancient sorrow. The elves did not die, not as men do, but they began to fade, their vibrant spirits becoming like ghosts in a world that was no longer their own. This was the final, quiet consequence of the long war that began with 3 jewels. The immense expenditure of their spirit in the struggles against Morgoth, and then Sauron had drained them. They had poured their essence into kingdoms, into battles, and into the very rings meant to halt this decline, and now the well was nearly dry. One by one, they turned their backs on the mortal shores, building gray ships in the havens of Mithlond, and following the Star of Eärendil back into the west. They were not fleeing a battle, but accepting a cosmic truth. Their age of dominion, of crafting continents with their songs and challenging gods with their swords, was irrevocably over. Middle-earth was being passed into the hands of its true inheritors, the mortals, a race defined not by memory and preservation, but by change, growth, and the brief, brilliant fire of their lives. The legacy of the Silmarils was this slow, graceful retreat, the final note in a symphony of light that had lasted for millennia, leaving the world a little dimmer, but ready for a new and different dawn. These heirlooms were not merely stored away in dusty treasuries. They were living memories. The shards of Narsil, the sword that cut the ring from Sauron, were kept at Rivendell, a stark, broken reminder of a victory that was almost complete. The Elessar, a green jewel of surpassing beauty, passed through the hands of kings and lords, said to have the power to heal lands and hearts weary from the long shadow. For the Dunedain, in their kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, these objects were the physical proof of their entire history. To hold the hilt of Narsil was to feel the weight of Eärendil's fall and Isildur's fateful choice. To look upon the LOTR was to remember the alliance with the Elves, a bond of friendship that had saved the world not once, but twice. They were heirlooms of hope and warning, carried forward into a new age. Each artifact whispered a story of sacrifice, of the blood spilled by elves and men together, all to secure the fragile peace their descendants now enjoyed. This was the final, quiet purpose of the Silmarils' long shadow. They had forged a legacy not of gold or gems, but of resilience. The free peoples had learned that their greatest treasures were not objects of power to be coveted, but the alliances they forged and the memories they preserved. The light of the lost jewels was gone, but in its place remained the enduring glow of hard-won wisdom, a light carried not in a stone, but in the heart of every free being who remembered the cost. Centuries later, a simple act of curiosity would force that final test. The one ring, lost for ages, was found by a hobbit, a creature of peace who desired nothing more than a quiet life in his comfortable hole. Yet this accidental discovery set in motion a chain of events that would demand everything from the free peoples. The Council of Elrond was not merely a meeting, it was a moment of profound reckoning. Here, in the last homely house, the heirs of every major story were gathered. There was Elrond himself, who had stood at the cracks of doom and witnessed Isildur's fatal choice. There was Aragorn, the hidden heir of Isildur, carrying the weight of his ancestors' failure and the hope of his line's redemption. And there were the representatives of dwarves and men, each with their own history of loss and resilience. The ring presented them with the same old poison in a new bottle. Its power offered a quick, decisive victory, a chance to master the enemy with his own weapon. But the wiser ones knew better. They remembered the Silmarils. They understood that to use the ring, to try and possess its power for good, would only repeat the ancient tragedy. The quest, therefore, had to be one of renunciation, not conquest. It was a mission to let go, to unmake, to destroy the very thing that promised ultimate power. Who could possibly be trusted with such a task? Not a great king or a mighty warrior, for they would be too easily tempted by the ring's promise of glory and order. The fate of the world instead fell upon the most unlikely of shoulders, a hobbit named Frodo Baggins, whose greatest strength was his humility. His journey to Mount Doom was the ultimate expression of the lesson learned through rivers of elven and human blood. It was a refusal to possess, a rejection of the oath, a quiet, stubborn march toward letting go. This was the final working out of the destiny forged by the Silmarils. Every alliance formed, every sacrifice made from the First Age onward, had built toward this single, fragile fellowship. The dwarf and elf who learned to fight side by side, the man who pledged his sword to protect the ring-bearer, the wizard who guided them all. These bonds were the living answer to the isolation and pride of Fëanor. The quest was a test to see if the world could finally break the cycle, if the free peoples could master the shadow of their own history by choosing cooperation over dominion and sacrifice over possession. That final, defining struggle unfolded not as one great battle, but as a constellation of desperate stands across the map of Middle-earth. Each free people, drawing on the deep wells of their own history, faced a test that their ancestors could never have imagined. In the north, the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain and the men of Dale were assailed by a vast Easterling army. remember the ancient dwarf cities of Noldor and Belugost, whose alliance with the Elves once forged weapons of legend. That legacy of stubborn endurance now echoed in the halls of Erebor. King Dane Ironfoot stood firm before his gate, an old and fierce dwarf lord, while the archers of Dale, heirs to the brave Edain, fought from crumbling walls. They were not fighting for dominion or for gold, but for the simple survival of their homes, proving that the courage of the free peoples was not diminished, only refined by time. Meanwhile, in the Golden Hall of Meduseld, a different kind of test was unfolding. The Rohirrim, the horse lords of Rohan, found their king ensnared by the whispered poison of Saruman. Their strength was being turned inward, a paralysis that threatened to neutralize one of the last great cavalry forces in the world. It took an outsider, a hobbit of the Shire, to help break that spell. This was no accident. It was a direct result of the alliances woven over millennia, a fragile network of trust that now allowed a small, quiet people to help reawaken a great one. When the call for aid finally came, the Rohirrim did not hesitate. Their thunderous charge across the Pelennor fields was more than a military maneuver. It was the embodiment of an ancient oath, a fulfillment of the promise that men would stand with men, that the descendants of the Edain would not abandon their kin in the final hour. They rode into what seemed like certain death, a sea of terror and monsters, with a song on their lips, because their shared history had taught them that some lights are worth extinguishing your own to save. And what of the Elves? Their power was fading, their time ending, but they did not simply board their ships and depart. In the deep woods of Lothlorien and under the trees of Mirkwood, the Elven realms endured repeated assaults, holding Sauron's attention and his forces, buying precious time for the world of men to rally. They fought not for a future they would inhabit, but for a world they were choosing to leave behind. This was their ultimate wisdom, the final lesson learned from the pride of Fëanor. They had once crossed a sea to reclaim jewels. Now, they made their last stand to ensure others could inherit the dawn. Every sword drawn at Helm's Deep, every axe swung at the gates of Erebor, and every elven arrow loosed from the Golden Wood was a thread in a single, desperate tapestry. The War of the Ring was the culmination of every alliance forged and every tragedy endured since the first Silmaril was stolen. It proved that the true power of the free peoples was never in a jewel, a ring, or a king, but in the stubborn, resilient choice to stand together when the night was darkest. And so it came down to a single, impossible moment at the heart of the mountain. Frodo Baggins stood at the very edge of the crack of doom, the fires of Orodruin blazing below him. The journey was over, the quest fulfilled, but the ring, in its final, desperate act of self-preservation, unleashed its full will upon its bearer. All the sacrifices, all the alliances, every story of courage from ages past, narrowed to this pinpoint in time. Frodo did not cast the ring into the fire. He claimed it for his own, slipping it onto his finger and vanishing from sight. After everything, the cycle was about to repeat. The desire to possess, the very curse that began with Fëanor's oath, had ensnared even the most humble heart at the final, critical second. The fate of every free people now hung by a thread, and that thread was not held by a king or a warrior, but by a wretched, broken creature who had been tracking them through the dark. Gollum emerged from the shadows, a thing of pure hunger, and leaped upon the invisible hobbit. In a frantic, violent struggle, He bit down, severing the finger from Frodo's hand with a terrible cry. He had his precious back at last, but his victory lasted only a heartbeat. Staggering with mad, gleeful triumph, he lost his footing on the treacherous ledge and fell, his shriek of joy turning into a long, fading wail of terror as he plunged into the consuming fire, the ring still clutched in his hand. The destruction was not an act of heroic sacrifice or calculated strategy. It was the culmination of a mercy shown in the dark, a pity that Bilbo Baggins had chosen long ago in the caves under the misty mountains. That single, compassionate decision to not kill a miserable creature had, through a chain of events no one could have foreseen, saved the world. The cycle of doom that began with an oath to pursue any who withheld a Silmaril was finally broken, not by a great act of power, but by a small act of pity and the chaotic, unintended consequence that flowed from it. The One Ring was unmade. In that instant, far away in Mordor, the dark tower trembled, cracked, and collapsed into dust. Sauron's power, a shadow that had stretched across 3 ages, dissolved into a shrill, fading wind, a final, powerless sigh of malice. The war was over. The shadow had passed, and a gentle, ordinary light returned to the world. With the One Ring unmade and Sauron's power scattered to the winds, the long war was finally, truly over. The Fourth Age dawned, and it was declared the Age of Men. The great elven rings, their power faded with the destruction of their master, no longer held back the flow of time. The magic that had preserved the elven havens in a bubble of eternal twilight began to dissipate, like a morning mist under a rising sun. One by one, the Eldar made their choice. They journeyed to the Grey Havens, building sleek, white ships to carry them along the straight road, following the Star of Eärendil back into the west. They were not fleeing a broken land, but fulfilling a destiny, their long labors in Middle-earth complete. Their departure was a bittersweet melody, a slow, graceful diminuendo after a symphony of millennia. They left behind forests that would slowly forget their songs, and mountains that would no longer echo with the sound of their hammers. Yet they also left a profound and lasting gift, a foundation of wisdom upon which the new age would be built. The kingdoms of men did not rise in ignorance. In the north, the reunited kingdom of Arnor and Gondor flourished under King Elisar, the heir of Isildur, whose reign was guided by the very lore preserved in the House of Elrond. He married Arwen Undomil, and in their union, the bloodlines of elves and men were symbolically woven together for the final time. The white tree bloomed once more in the courts of Minas Tirith, a living emblem of this inherited grace. The dwarves delved anew in their mountains, and the hobbits tended their peaceful shire, all free to shape their own futures, unburdened by the shadow of a dark lord. And what of the Silmarils, the 3 jewels that had set this entire epic in motion? Their physical light was gone from the world. One rested in the earth's fiery core, another in the deep, cold abyss of the sea, and the third sailed the heavens as a star, a permanent, hopeful beacon. They remained as a powerful memory, a dual lesson of both sublime beauty and terrible cost. They were the ultimate paradox, objects of such perfection that they inspired both the highest love and the most destructive pride. Their legacy, however, was not the jewels themselves, but what their story forged in the peoples of Arda. The relentless pursuit of those gems taught the free peoples the futility of isolation and the poison of possession. It forced elves, dwarves, and men to look past their differences and discover strength in alliance. It tempered their spirit in fires of unimaginable loss, creating a resilience that would carry them through the darker days of the Second and Third Ages. The light of the Silmarils did not just vanish, it was transformed. It lived on in the courage of a hobbit who chose pity over vengeance, in the loyalty of a king who reunited a broken kingdom, and in the quiet wisdom of all who understood that some things are too beautiful to be owned, and that true strength is found not in mastering the light, but in sharing its warmth.